Welcome back to the Deep 404. Tonight, I'm going to just read a little bit from Simplicius the Thinker's latest Substack article. There are two amazing stories that are told in there. One of them is from a Ukrainian company commander, Nikolai Melnik, whose call sign is Fritz. He was part of Ukraine's 47th Brigade. The 47th were the NATO-trained brigade that received the Bradleys and all of the US and NATO equipment. They're also the brigade that have suffered tremendous losses since the Ukrainian offensive started in June. Anyhow, I'm going to just read a little bit about his story from an interview that he's given, talking about how he was injured. He ultimately lost both of his legs and damage to his limbs, his arms. But I'll just read through a little bit about this. This is from Simplicius's article. Melnik goes on to describe how he got badly injured, losing his legs in the opening assault. First, a heavy caliber bullet tore one leg apart, and apparently as he fell back from that hit, he landed his other leg on a landmine. So he was asked the question, how did you get blown up? What was it like? How? He said, we called the Bradley, which was supposed to evacuate the first wounded. I saw that it was about to drive across a minefield, so I jumped out of the landing and started waving my hands where to go, trying to get the attention of the Bradley driver so they wouldn't drive into the mines. He said, I heard shots and then saw my leg fly off. I was surprised. Most likely, it was a large caliber machine gun because there were tanks in the enemy's position and they were working. I started jumping on my left leg, stepped on an anti-personnel mine and fell on my back. Apparently the petal worked. Here the petal he's talking about, the small petal mine. It's given the shape of them. They're sometimes known as, well, they were originally known as green parrots, small anti-personnel mines. He then says, he talks about the Russian advanced mining, so the forward mining. He said there was a massive remote mining. Every 10 meters in the sky, there was an explosion, an explosion, an explosion. The sky turned pitch black. I've never seen anything like it in the movies. So what he's talking about here is how these petal mines were deployed. So the Russians, in this case, launching from these mine-launching vehicles that they have, cassette-type mining devices, which would, as he was saying, every 10 meters in the sky, these things were appearing, exploding open, and then just distributing hundreds, thousands of these small petal-shaped anti-personnel mines everywhere. So he goes on to say, after stepping on one of these, the detonation went off and I turned over on my stomach. Something also went off under my chest and I was thrown again. I have good armor, so the blast wave went through my arms. After all these explosions, I fell down, lying down and looking around. My hands were burned. I realized that I can't do anything for myself now, but my friend Piro was next to me and I called out, Piro, help. Piro ran across the minefield to save me, and he did. In a minute or two, he put 4 tourniquets on me, somehow tied my leg with paracord and pulled me out. I mean, wow, that is just a hard to comprehend retelling of a story. Later in the article, I suggest you go and read it, look for Simplicius the Thinker on Substack and subscribe if you haven't already subscribed to his channel. But Fritz, later on, somehow when he's asked about, after he'd been to hospital and he had some time to heal, about would he go back to the fighting, and somehow he's kept a sense of humour. He's joking about the fact that he would like to, but he just doesn't have enough limbs anymore to do it. That black humour. Anyhow, just an amazing story, and just gives you some sense of the density of mining that the Russians have been deploying into the battlefield. making it so difficult for the Ukrainians and for the Russians, of course, when they're trying to advance, but for the Ukrainians to advance. Fritz goes on to talk about the fact that when they made their advances, they could only move forwards or backwards along a road because of the mining on either side. And in some cases, he said, because they had mined it themselves. It was the Ukrainian area that they had mined. But so they were restricted in their ability to move and turn. And then when they did need to get out of vehicles, then they had to deal with the anti-personnel mines, which, as you can see, are dropped in such a density that they appear to be a number of them within a square metre. He stood on one and then fell on one. Really quite astounding to try to survive through that. So that's the first of the stories that gets told in Simplicis's article. The next one, he goes on and he recounts and retells a translation from a book which has just come out called Poland at War. And it is a mashup of interviews that the author, who is a journalist, Zbigniew Parafianowicz, has made with several high-ranking members of the Polish government and presidential office, as well as army and special officers, with some other comments from their Ukrainian counterparts. Now, all of the people who have commented have remained anonymous, and when I read some of the things that are revealed here, you can understand why. Starting off with the fact that Polish Special Forces commandos were in fact present in Kiev during the opening operation. So at the start of the conflict back in February of 2022, there were Polish Special Forces already in Kiev at that time, and they remained there for some time. Simplicius goes on to reason that they are still there. Now, I do recall months ago reports from the Russians that in some areas, when they're listening to the intercepted radio chatter from the Ukrainians, in some areas, particularly up north towards Kiev, all they could hear was Polish being spoken. So this seems to lend some weight to that. But these Polish special forces were in Kiev during the opening operation, including the Gostomel assault. Now, the Battle of Gostomel was the first major battle in this special military operation, and it was fought between Ukrainian and Russian forces for Gostomel. They fought for Gostomel and Bucha and Irpin, in order to attempt to encircle the Ukrainian capital city of Kiev from the west. This is then followed up further in these excerpts from this book, that the story of Kiev being taken in 3 days, which isn't something which Vladimir Putin or Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu ever said. This came from the West, but in this reporting, apparently Americans were convinced that Kiev would fall within 3 days. So maybe this is where this originated from, and had prepared to evacuate up to 40,000 people from Kiev, presumably American citizens, and also a Ukrainian political elite and establishment. In this book, it's reporting that U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was the person most concerned and skeptical of Ukraine's chances of defending Kiev, and believing that Kiev would fall within this 3-day period. The reporting goes on to also say that in the early part of the invasion, that Ukrainian Foreign Affairs Minister Kuleba and his family fled to Ukraine to wait out and see what would happen, and that the same invitation was extended to the rest of Ukraine's elite at that time. Now, there were reports back at the start, early unconfirmed reports, that Zelensky and others had moved to Poland for safety, and that they were phoning in some of their reports using green screens and things, appearing to be in Ukraine when perhaps they weren't. So again, this book coming out now seems to lend some credence to some of those stories back then. MiG-29s. So in an attempt to provide support to Ukraine, but without bringing Russian attacks upon Poland themselves. This story is that the Polish dismantled around 10 Polish MiG-29 fighter jets, packed them in crates, left them in parts next to the border with Ukraine, and then called Kiev, notified them that there were some MiG-29 parts just sitting in the forests over here. Don't know anything about them, but you could go and pick them up if you wanted to. Reportedly, the Ukrainians went there, picked up the MiG-29s, reassembled them. Allegedly, the Polish contacted Kiev and said, were you okay with reassembling the MiG-29s? And they said, yes, no problem. And the reason that they had no problem was that the Ukrainians at that time, again, backing up reports that we had from that time, were playing whack-a-mole with their fighter aircraft in Ukraine, launching them off highway runways, not using an area for more than 24 hours, taking the planes of one temporary runway and landing them somewhere else, so that they couldn't be picked off by Russians, learning where they were keeping and storing the MiG-29s. Now, this ties up with reporting from a few months ago when there were Russian missile strikes on the Khmelnytsky airfield, which is in sort of central Ukraine and back behind the front line quite a bit. Now, reportedly, this airfield had become a common airfield for the launching of Su-24s, and the Su-24s at that time were equipped to carry Storm Shadow ballistic missiles. So again, this book, if the reporting in it is true, backs up some of those unconfirmed reports we had at that time, that while that airport was being used for Su-24s, there was a strike made on the airport a number of times and Su-24s survived, and that they were perhaps shuttling around the country. There was even talk at that time that they were perhaps shuttling out of Ukraine, low-level flying to Poland so that they would remain safe and out of touch from Russian missiles within Ukraine. That was at the time considered to be a very risky option if the Ukrainians were doing that, because, as is mentioned in this book, at the time, Russia had warned against using Western air bases by Ukrainian aviation, and they had threatened that it may be regarded as involvement of that Western nation supporting Ukraine if they were lending their air bases to Ukrainian jets. This, which was perceived by the Polish as in a worst case scenario, meaning that if they were to do that and the Russians found out about it, that those Polish air bases could come under attack from the Russians. There is also there's reporting in this book that at one stage the Polish were openly stating and proposing that Polish jets would fly to the German Ramstein airbase. At this stage, the Polish were growing frustrated with the US, who the US weren't providing support, which was being discussed, to Ukraine. So very early on in the piece, it seems as though the Polish were very much aligned and supporting Ukraine. That has changed over time, as we've seen. But they had openly announced to the US that the Polish were reaching the point where they would fly MiG-29s to German Ramstein airbase, land them, and then their Polish pilots would walk home or take the bus home. They didn't care what happened with those planes, but they were putting them there so that they could be flown to Ukraine if NATO wanted to use them in Ukraine. Basically, this was, I think, a way that the Polish were trying to draw the Americans into supporting and saying, hey, look, if you want us to put our air bases at risk, well, how about you put your German-American air base at risk too? This is a really, really good article. The book apparently is written in Polish, printed in Polish only at this stage. So I can't read it, or can't read it to you. But if it comes out in English, it does sound like it'll be a really fascinating read. Also, it goes on to talk about the fact that there was lots of extra unannounced military equipment provided by Poland to Ukraine. While it has long been thought that there was a lot of this going on, clearly the MiG-29s are an example of this. But it has apparently happened to such an extent that it seriously degraded Poland's own military capability. And there is talk that as much as 350 T-72 tanks were provided from Poland to Ukraine, 300 BMP-1s. BMP-1s are these sort of very short, squat fighting vehicles, 72 Crab self-propelled howitzers, 126 2S1 self-propelled howitzers, 60 Grad multiple launch rocket system, 2 dozen S-125 and S-200 air defense systems, and a lot of other stuff which reportedly came straight out of Polish field units. And this is thought to be one of the contributing reasons to why it's being kept a secret, and also as an explanation for why Poland's military spending has gone up to 4% of its GDP to be able to try and fill some of the gaps that were created by this. So look, this there is more. There's a lot more in Simplikis's article, and there's obviously a lot more in that book. If you can read Polish, I would suggest have a read. There's also more about Fritz. It's a really, really good article, so I suggest that you check that out and have a read of that. I just wanted to talk and touch on that, but then just another couple of items. One, North Korea has announced just a few hours ago that it is now completely withdrawing from the 2018 Inter-Korean Agreement. This was an agreement between North and South Korea to stop certain types of military activity. This has also coincided with North Korea testing another ballistic missile. It's the first one within 2 months, and it has followed, and this announcement of North Korea withdrawing from the Inter-Korean Agreement has followed South Korea's announcement on Wednesday that it has decided to partially suspend the Inter-Korean Agreement and resume flying surveillance aircraft along the border. And this has been done in reaction to the North Korean satellite launch. So the North Koreans have just launched a reconnaissance satellite, which will allow them to look over South Korea and Japan. So for that reason, South Korea has said, well, we're going to start flying our surveillance aircraft again. So North Korea has said, okay, well, we're going to completely disregard the agreement that we had. Here's a ballistic missile test. Oh, and by the way, we're going to move hardware and forces up to the DMZ. So very, very interesting conflict escalating in another area now. So we've got the conflict in Ukraine, we've got the conflict in Israel with Hamas, we've got activity in Syria and Iraq, and we've now got escalation going on in North Korea. All right, moving away from North Korea and just moving to something here. I'm just going to show some footage here for you to have a look at this. This is quite amazing, I feel. Now, this is an insane tactic which the Russians have used against a Ukrainian position. This sort of tactic is something that I had read about happening in World War I. I'll play the video, have a little bit of a look at this, and then I'll talk about what's going on here. You see that massive explosion caused there. Then you will see this hole in the ground, and you'll see a whole heap of men, Russian soldiers, which appear to just be coming up out of the hole in the ground. You can see them there. You'll see one arriving from the left, coming out of the ground there. What has happened here is the Russians have dug a tunnel underneath the Ukrainian position. Once they're underneath the position, they've used a massive mine. They've planted a monstrously large mine there, as you can see from the explosion. If I just take this right back to the start here and just play that again, you see the size of the explosion there. They've tunneled under the Ukrainian position, placed this mine, and then from the crater that has been left has left an opening to their tunnel under the Ukrainian position. So as the footage continues, you see the Russians start to emerge from the crater. So clearly they would have stepped back. They would have stepped back into the tunnel to a safe distance, detonated the mine, and then they've run out. Now you imagine the poor Ukrainian soldiers who are in this position here. They're in a position probably feeling as though they're quite relatively safe. Suddenly they think they've been bombed with a massive, probably think they've been hit by a 500 kilo bomb by the size of the blast. And the next thing they know, they are being overrun by a company of Russian soldiers who have just, to them, it would have seemed, appeared from nowhere. It really is, quite an interesting and effective tactic for taking a position. And for the Russians, I imagine taking a position for very little or no losses. They would have had the complete element of surprise here. And not only that, as I say, they would have appeared like genies in the middle of the Ukrainian position while the Ukrainians were suffering from concussion and shock of the mine going off underneath them. In another piece of nightmare news for the Ukrainians, military summary channel Dima there has done a report today indicating new capability which the Russian FPV drones have now. So if the overwhelming number of FPV drones that the Russians have in the Kherson area already isn't enough, what has been released now is video footage from the Russian drone pilots showing them now capable of making attacks at night. So the FPV drones are now equipped with Russian-produced night vision ability. So the drones, which could normally fly during the day, they can now fly and attack at night. And there's video footage coming out of these attacks being made on Ukrainian barges and boats as they're trying to get across the Dnieper River to resupply stock and probably evacuate injured from Krinky, the area on the left-hand side of the Dnieper River where the Ukrainians have established some foothold. As I've said before, the foothold that they've established, I've struggled to see the reason for why they are doing it, other perhaps than just some media PR ability to be able to say that, hey, we are across the Dnieper. The Russians can't keep us on the west bank of the Dnieper. We're on the eastern bank now and we're advancing. But the Ukrainian soldiers who are there are just suffering hell, and now it seems as though the time when they did have some relative safety for evacuation of injured soldiers, for resupply and for rotation of troops, is now threatened by the attack of nighttime FPV drone strikes. All right, that's it for tonight. Again, if you are enjoying the channel, please subscribe if you haven't already. If you think you know people who enjoy the channel, please share it with them. And I do hope that you're enjoying the channel, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.